I don't need to do anything, do I? I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Today we are very lucky to have a doctor. Is it doctor? Yeah. Dr. Clint Boal. Oh yes, if I'd have read past the third word. And I have read this, but y'all know me. Anyway, so Clint is going to discuss with us. He's a raptor guy, and so I'm just going to introduce Clint. Received his MS and his PhD degrees from the University of Arizona, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Minnesota. He has been a US Geological Survey wildlife biologist since 2000. Stationed at Texas Tech University, where he holds a joint appointment as Professor of Wildlife Ecology. He supervises graduate students and has authored or co-authored over 130 journal papers, co-authored the award-winning book Raptors of Texas, and co-edited 3 other books. He is a past president of the Raptor Research Foundation and has received multiple research recognitions, including the Barney Rushing Jr. Outstanding Researcher Award from Texas Tech University, the Fran and Frederick Hamerstrom Award from the Raptor Research Foundation, and the Excellence in Science Award from the US Geological. And to introduce a little bit of what he's going to discuss, so the Southern High Plains was the last region of the continental US that was settled. This was because of tribal people preventing settlement until the late 1870s. This also prevented any detailed understanding of the biological communities on the prairie grasslands. Once the Comanche War ended, settlement occurred so rapidly that little meaningful biological information was obtained before dramatic landscape and ecological changes took place. Clint is going to discuss what was known or can be surmised for raptor communities pre-settlement, then examine how raptor communities have changed regionally to what we see today. Clint? Do you need one? Is
that okay? All right. Right. Everybody in here is a bunch of birders, right? Okay. What's the species? Beep. Yeah. No guesses? Okay. There we go. Dartmoor Swainson's. Okay. No more testing. I won't do that anymore. Okay. It's a Dartmoor Swainson's hawk, which is one that's kind of nice to see up in my area. Okay. So how many of you, just by show of hands, how many of you have been up on the kind of that region between, say, Midland, Texas, up to Amarillo or the Kansas, the Oklahoma-Kansas borders? Okay.
Does driving through count?
Yes, yes, you've driven through. Was it at night? No, so it was daylight, so you had to see it. Sorry. Okay, okay. So I want you to close your eyes, okay? And that landscape, picture a flat expanse of grassland as far as the eye can see. Okay? Herds of bison, more than you can count. Prairie chickens dancing on the prairies. Okay? Okay? You can open your eyes now. But that's what it was like at that time. I didn't say you saw any trees. Okay? And this is something really to keep in mind, I think, as we talk about this. So, okay, yeah. So the southern High Plains is we talk about the Caprock Escarpment is to the east, the Mescalero Escarpment is to the west. It kind of peters out into the Trans-Pecos region to the south, and then to the north you have the Canadian River, and then it continues on into the southern Great Plains. Geographically, the area is flat as a pancake. It has a slight topographic decline from west to east, and that's kind of the direction that any water flows. But there's really no rivers to speak of up there. There's other than a couple of minor ones. The Canadian River does flow through it, but the water up there typically is standing in what we call the playa lakes. That's the natural, there's no outflow to them. The water's there until it evaporates or absorbs into the ground. Okay. So it was a grassland that was very dry. Okay. When Francisco Coronado, the first European to explore this area in 1541, he quoted, this is from his journal, "I reached some plains so vast that I did not find their limit anywhere I went, although I traveled over them for more than 300 leagues, with no more landmarks than if we had been swallowed up by the sea. There was not a stone, not a bit of rising ground, not a tree, nor shrub, nor anything to go by." Okay. So if you didn't have a compass, you had to use the sun or the stars because there was no landmarks to go by. And so this is kind of what it was like historically. And on top of that, there was this critical water shortage. There were a few springs in existence up there that are largely gone today because of groundwater pumping. So the reason that the tribal peoples of this region, which were the Comanches, could persist there is they knew where those springs were. They knew the landscape. They knew their way around. Any person of European settlement that went up into this area, they were just going to their death, basically, at the time. Okay. Another thing from Coronado is the country the buffalo traveled over was so smooth that if one looked at them, the sky could be seen between their legs, just an indication of how flat it was. Okay. Okay. Couple hundred years later, 15, 40, 15, 16, yeah, 300 years or so later, a cavalry group went through there, led by General Marcy, and he basically said the exact same thing. "We were upon the high tableland. A view presented itself as boundless as the ocean. Not a tree, shrub, or any other object, either animate or inanimate, relieved the dreary monotony of the prospect." He must have gone through when the bison weren't around or something. It was a vast, illimitable expanse of desert prairie, a treeless, desolate waste of uninhabitable solitude, which always has been and must continue uninhabited forever. Okay. Okay. A few years later, another cavalry group went up there, the Lieutenant Robert Carter in 1871, and basically he said the exact same thing. Okay. The point is, there were no trees other than the occasional maybe hackberry or something by a playa or a spring that held water. Okay. Now think about that in context of a bird. Okay. The Llano Estacado, the Southern Great Plains, it was the last region, as I said, or as Allison said earlier, it was the last region of the United States that was settled by people of European descent. Okay. And that was because of the Comanches. And they ruled that area until the mid 1870s, when the Comanche Wars ended and the Comanches were moved onto reservations in Oklahoma. Okay. The landscape change that occurred with this, only this, I'm getting a little bit out of order here, but prior to the Anglo settlement, the region was the vegetation wildlife complex that had existed for centuries. So for hundreds of years, that community had existed up there with the bisons being the primary drivers and prairie dogs being the environmental engineers of that landscape. Once the tribal peoples were conquered and put on the reservations, this changed very rapidly. The first large-scale organized ranching was in 1876 by the Goodnight Ranch and the Adair Ranch. Bison were almost completely wiped out shortly thereafter. If it hadn't been for a small herd that were kept by, I believe it was Goodnight's wife, we wouldn't even have bison in Texas anymore. Okay. So the free range was mostly gone, and ranches and barbed wire were all over by 1884. And you can kind of see, think about that landscape and what you're seeing in this picture. So ranching became really big. Heavy duty grazing was going on. And then in the 1870s and early 1880s, those were boom years for the cattle production. Everybody knows the history of, the cattle trains to Dodge City and everything. But then blizzards came in the 1880s and killed thousands of cattle. There were multiple years of that. And then the whole ranching endeavors collapsed on the Great Plains. Most of the ranches that survived were those that were off the Cap Rock into the rolling plains. And today, today more cattle are produced on feedlots than there are free range cattle. Okay. But the changes that occurred when you had that ranching startup, you had ranch houses. And if you have ranch houses, you have to have water. So they drill for water. And if you have ranch houses, you want shade. And so you plant trees. Okay. And if you have ranch houses, you have trading posts. Trading posts lead to settlements. It's like, the gas station that's at the crossroads, and then there's another support store there, a little mercantile, and then somebody's house because they have to have people working there, and it all grows up from that. Along with that came the roads, the railroads, and the telegraph lines. In this area, the first permanent settlement was in Crosby County in 1879. And there were 1,700 people living in the Southern High Plains by 1890. And then rapid agriculture took off through that period. And again, an image of the picture, that flat landscape with this small house out in the middle of a bunch of plowed field. Okay. Really rapid changes of what it had once been. And then we had the Dust Bowl era. Came in and the agricultural community collapsed. We lost who knows how much topsoil through all this. But by the late 1950s, they had improved groundwater pumping and center pivot irrigation. And that allowed a whole new generation and methods for agricultural production. I'm going to skip by this for a period of time. But this kind of history of that area, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is just to paint the picture that what was once largely something like you're seeing here has become quite changed. You had that collapse of really the rural areas, the isolated ranch houses. So now if you're driving through up there, you'll find a grassland that is mostly invasive weeping love grass or old world blue stem and an abandoned house out in the middle of it and a dead tree. Or maybe not a dead tree, maybe it's a live tree or a couple. Okay. And then interspersed among all this, you have a city like Lubbock, which is basically an island of forestry. So think about it, that Great Plains has changed to a sea of agriculture. What was once a sea of grass has now transformed largely to a sea of agriculture, mostly cotton, which for wildlife purposes is not much better than pavement, in my opinion. And that's kind of a pessimistic view, but it is, I think, fairly accurate. As you get farther north, you have more open grassland and rangeland. But functionally, my story holds is that it's largely this big sea of agriculture and invasive grasses and these islands of treed vegetation that are associated with urban areas. That's the big landscape change that's occurred. And there you see a kind of an example of the center pivots. On top of this, we have oil pumps all over the place, and we have these wind farms going in. Okay. So dramatic landscape changes over 150 years. The thing is that compared to other areas of the US, this group is named after Audubon. Back in the 1700s, there were a lot of naturalists that were documenting the wildlife, the natural fauna in the eastern US, the southeastern US, even the western US in Arizona and California and the Pacific Northwest. This area of Texas, that panhandle region, the Cap Rock Escarpment, was largely undocumented what was there until after the Comanche Wars were over. What was known, the long expedition in 1819 and 1820, Peel, who the Peel's falcon is named after, the Peel's peregrine, and Thomas Say, who we all know the Say's phoebe was named after, they went through and they did the first descriptions of many species. These guys were typically some kind of naturalist assigned to a cavalry detachment that was going through, so they had that military protection. And you can see a list of some of the species that were the first recorded on that trip up there. Okay. The Whipple expedition and then the Macaulay expedition and the Ruffner surveys. These were the only ones that really recorded information for this region at the time. Let me go back. And basically, the descriptions that they had for these areas was, you come up on the grasslands out of like the Canadian River, and it's just that, it's grassland. I've gone back through some of these records, and there's no mention of like kestrels. There's no mention of Swainson's hawks. There is some mention of burrowing owls. Apparently, they taste pretty good because these guys were cavalry guys, you know, and they're getting baby burrowing owls like kill penguins, I guess, when you're in the Arctic and stuff. Pardon? Well, I guess if you're eating, you know, dried rations all the time, something fresh might be pretty good. But so after the end of the Comanche Wars and the settlement, they started doing some surveys up there. And this is a list of pretty much everything I could find as far as surveys that were done historically through that area. The Strecker 1910 and 1912, those were mostly bird lists from in the Canadian River area, in the Paladuro Canyon area. You look at Hibbett's, birds seen along the creeks and canyons or on the plains within 40 miles of the canyon. Nice did a hawk census from Arizona to Massachusetts in 1934. Stevenson did birds of the central panhandle of Texas. Allen and Sim, these were the first real survey-based data because they were doing these driving surveys from like Kansas down through Oklahoma and through Texas, and they were counting birds on telegraph wires. And actually in 1943, that second one, that's the first real record for Mississippi kites outside of the Paladuro and Canadian River areas. Hawkins, Thompson, and the Oberholzer's BirdLife of Texas has some good information in that. Okay, and then more contemporary things as far as the raptors go is Ken Seifert's excellent book on birds of the Texas Panhandle, which is a very, I mean, for a birds per region area, that is a comprehensive book. Catron's Raptors of New Mexico, and then Farquhar, my book on Raptors of Texas, documenting some of the natural history of the birds around here. So those are the kind of the contemporary overviews. So what raptors currently occur? And this picture is just, this set of pictures is just a sample of the different raptors that we will have on the Southern Great Plains, depending on the time of year. This isn't even getting into the nocturnal birds. And what I want to do for the rest of this, I hope that I kind of gave you a picture of how rapid the change was and what little was really known because there just wasn't that much survey effort going on. I'm going to focus in on these species, 5 species, and talk about what was known and how much change has occurred for them, positive or negative. Okay, and so we're going to talk about Mississippi kites, Swainson's hawks, ferruginous hawks, the American kestrel, and burrowing owls. Okay. Now, so for Mississippi kites, what was reported in 1820? They were recorded along the Canadian River by Mulhausen. Macaulay, who went across the Great Plains, he didn't report them. Strecker in 1910 reported only one kite was seen, and that was up in the Canadian River and the Paladuro area. 1914 to 1936, no reports for bird visits to Paladuro or Canyon, Texas, by multiple different birders that went in there. By 1942, it was a regular summer resident of Paladuro Canyon. That should be Canyon, not Canton. Sorry about that. 1943, Allen and Sim, they said they were confined to wooded river bottoms. Those are the guys that were doing the driving transects. And so they're picking them up on those power lines through the river bottoms. Hawkins found them common along from Canadian to Miami to Oklahoma. That's Canadian, Texas to Miami, Texas. There's a big riparian corridor in there on the Canadian River. And then it appears by 1974, there'd been a rapid expansion from bottom forest to the prairie across that 50 years. And that probably had to do with that settlement and the housing that goes in. So the current status of kites is I would pose that in this region, they're the most common summer raptor up there. Swainson's may be more common, but I would suggest that by the densities we have in areas like Amarillo and Lubbock and Plainview, places like that, that this bird numerically for the region is at least up there in the top number of raptors seen, which is a remarkable change over 100 to 150 years. And they really benefit from this creation of urban forest. I mean, you don't find them typically out across agricultural landscapes. On rare occasion, you might if there's an abandoned house and some trees. Usually there's Swainson's hawks in that. And so they really congregate in these urban areas. The long-term population trend from the BCR or BCR 18, which is what that area is in, was a 62% annual change between 1966 and 2019. Not a lot of research had been done on this species until not a lot of research had been done on this species in this region until I got up there and started doing some work with them. And we found that this species has pretty high site and pair fidelity. I've had nests on the Texas Tech campus that were reoccupied by the same color banded birds for 10 years. Okay, those are round trips down to South America and back, you know. And that couple are staying together through that migration and nesting successes and failures. They, for a bird of prey, for what we know for birds of prey, they have pretty high survival rates. I have one bird that actually, Ben Skipper back here, he banded as a graduate student. That bird's 17 years old at a minimum. And it's probably a few years older than that. And so for a raptor that only weighs 230 grams or so, that's a really old bird. And we have multiple that are in that, 14, 15, 16-year range. Studies we have, how many of you have heard that Mississippi kites are aggressive? Just one person? That's all? Okay. Trust me, up there you hear about Mississippi kites being aggressive all the time. And this is something that it's unfounded. It's that confirmation bias. You hear about a shark attack on the news. So everybody's concerned about shark attacks. Lately, it's about rattlesnakes. Everybody hears about rattlesnakes. Getting bit by a rattlesnake, getting attacked by a shark, it just doesn't happen that often. But it's always in our mind because it's a dramatic thing. Well, you hear about the golfer that got dive bombed by a kite, and so everybody's concerned about kites. Well, they don't know about all the other kites that are around that don't pay them the time of day. And we did experimental work with. This is what professors do. You get an undergraduate technician to walk under a kite nest while you watch, right? So for real, we did this at a lot of kite nests, and we found that kite aggression, only about 16% of walking directly under a nest would elicit an aggressive response. And a lot of those responses aren't even directly aggressive. They're calling and flying around. So their reputation is a bit exaggerated. Okay. Swainson's hawks. This is the other big dog hawk up in the Llano Estacado during the summer. This is another seasonal migrant. They spend their winters in Argentina and come up here in the summer. Macaulay said they were frequently seen along the Canadian and the Red River and their tributaries, which makes sense. Those are areas that you had all these cottonwood galleries. Up on the prairie, you didn't have any trees for them. By 1910, they're considered a common large hawk in the plains, but nest on the cliffs of the canyons due to scarcity of trees. So they would come up on the plains and hunt, but they're nesting off the cap rock. 1943, they're a common summer resident, nesting everywhere there are a few cottonwoods. The predominant raptor on the rangeland, often using telegraph wires and poles, feeding on roadkill rabbits. Okay. I'm sure they hunted other things than roadkill. 1945, uncommon summer resident, about one bird per 100 miles of road traveled. So maybe timing when those surveys were done or the areas they were done. Today, they're probably the most common boodio hawk, without question, in the southern high plains. In Dallam County, this is another species that I worked with up there when I first got up there. And in Dallam County, which is just that northwestmost county in Texas. I had 120 breeding pairs located there. That's a lot of hawks within one county, and a few over in New Mexico and Oklahoma on the Kiowa and Rita Blanca grasslands. And this species undoubtedly benefited from the planting of all the windbreaks. Now, you drive along the roads up there and you'll see a Siberian elm or a hackberry or a cottonwood. And if you drive in the winter, there's a good chance you're going to see a big stick nest in there, spaced about every mile to 2 miles along the roads. And the downside is a lot of times the fledglings get killed on the roads from roadkill. But if you get off the main highways and go down the dirt roads and stuff, it's the same pattern where there's trees, you're going to have Swainson's hawks oftentimes. So they have benefited from a population standpoint. This species has benefited regionally by European settlement of the region. They've experienced detrimental impacts in other areas of the country. Okay. Now, one of my favorite raptors is the ferruginous hawk. This is the biggest bootial hawk in North America. And before 1900, they were not reported in any of the pre-1900 reports, which is unusual because the ferruginous hawk historically would nest on the ground. They would use bison rib bones and other bones for their nests in areas where there were not trees or wood to use. And so they should have been out there on the grassland prairies. And they probably were, but there just wasn't enough expedition effort across there to survey for them. By 1912, it breeds abundantly in the Panhandle, numerous permanent residents. 1942, a few nest in the canyons. By 1943, only 17 were seen across 5,000 miles traveled in summer. And the summer is when you should really be seeing them because that's when they're around for breeding. Okay. 1943, it's a rare summer resident. No conclusive evidence of breeding in Texas. 1955, no longer listed as a summer breeding bird on the Panhandle checklists. When I got to Lubbock in 2000, in 2002, I started doing ferruginous hawk surveys because they're a species of greatest conservation need by Texas Parks and Wildlife. They were no longer a breeding bird in Texas. I found 17 nests up in that Dallam County area, 1 or 2 in Hartley County. And so they do still breed in Texas. There's not very many of them. Yeah, I kind of got a little bit of ahead of myself. And the ferruginous hawks, they probably, whereas the Swainson's hawk and the Mississippi kite really benefited from from European presence, ferruginous hawks did not. They're a big bird. Big birds often get shot because they're seen as more threatening. There was prairie dog eradication all over, both shooting and poisoning. And ferruginous hawks are Hoover vacuum cleaners for prairie dogs. That's basically what they eat in the Great Plains. And so between the loss of prairie dog colonies, the change of landscape to crop production, it was really kind of the death knell for ferruginous hawks at the numbers they probably were at historically. Okay. Burrowing owls probably had kind of the same experience. They were seen in great numbers by Macaulay. They're the ones, that group is the one that kind of did the taste test with them. Those huge prairie dog colonies don't exist any longer. Now, fortunately, burrowing owls don't need huge colonies. You can find a house lot that's got 3 or 4 prairie dogs holes there, and you may have a burrowing owl there in the summer. They're pretty adaptable. My wife did her master's degree on burrowing owls, so I learned quite a bit about them. And burrowing owls can really adjust to human presence if we don't harass them. But population-wise, they undoubtedly took a big hit. When they eradicated all the prairie dog colonies, that was a loss. Because burrowing owls do not dig their own burrows. At least the western burrowing owls do not. And so when you lose those burrows, you lose the burrowing owls. Okay? And then the agricultural conversion of the landscape. Even if you had burrows, if they got bladed up all the time, it's just not good for burrowing owls. We still have a fair number of burrowing owls around now, but oftentimes they're in areas that are getting bladed over and having housing put up, at least up where I live. And we have an issue with our the Llano Estacado Audubon Society right now dealing with housing tracts going in, and they're marking burrowing owl burrows. So they don't blade them because they're on eggs right now or they have young. And if you blade them, that's an illegal thing. And so they're trying to work with the contractors. Okay. And their species of concern, they've been in decline. Some areas, the population has been positive. You can see the colors, the blue on that is a positive, red is a negative. They're a species too that probably is suffering from pesticides that a lot of the smaller raptors seem to be experiencing. Okay. Okay. American kestrel. Everybody loves kestrels. They're like somebody took a bag of Skittles and molded a little raptor out of it, right? Macaulay reported them along the wooded streams, but not upon the Great Plain. So they're cavity nesters. They need trees, or they will also nest in pothole cavities and cliff walls. And so that's the only place you're going to find them pre-settlement, right? They weren't reported by Strecker in 1910. By 1934, Carlander reported them as rather common. Common is to one person may not be common to another. Russell said they were common in all the canyon areas. It's occasionally seen on the adjacent plain. By 1942, they were a common resident of the plains, according to Stevens. They were doing those driving surveys. Or no, Stevens, that was Allen and Sim. Well, maybe it was Stevens too. I'm getting confused with Stevens and then Allen and Sim. But basically, by the mid-40s, they were considered very common on the plains. And this is probably because kestrels are one of the easiest raptors in the world to survey. They love telephone lines and telegraph lines and power lines, and so they perch up and they're easy to count and see. But those lines were not around before, and they didn't have anything to perch on, so they were certainly not up on the prairie lands before the European settlement. An interesting thing is that this is where, as again with Allen and Sim, they found them to be abundant in winter. They found 10 in 36 miles. So one for every 3.6 miles. Most were seen in spring. They saw 45 across 2,400 miles. And they reported them frequently along tree growth, areas of tree growth, along railroad tracks, on telephone poles, right where we'd expect to see them. Oberholzer, in 1960s and 70s, described them as almost wiped out as a breeder and much reduced as a wintering species, uncommon and local in the northern panhandle. Any ideas why? DDT. DDT knocked out our peregrines, they knocked out our osprey, they knocked out our bald eagles. Well, DDT may not have been direct chemical contaminants on kestrels, but it was taking out what they were eating. Probably. It could have been a combination of those. But that's kind of that linkage. That's probably what was going on with what Oberholzer was seeing. Kestrels still aren't out of the woods. Right now, with American kestrels, we're seeing a continent-wide population decline. These are some work colleagues of mine did looking at long-term trends at the continental level. There are areas where they seem to be kind of stabilized, but there has been this long-term continental trend. Part of that may be that where we started from when we were counting them, okay? Were they artificially increased when we started counting? So kestrels do not like dense woodlands. Okay? If you clear out woodlands and you have these open areas with some edge rows of trees, that's what they love. They have cavities and they have the open grass fields they can hunt over. That's exactly what we did across much of the eastern US since settlement. And so one of the questions that we're looking at is, did we change the landscape such in those areas that when we actually started counting kestrels, their numbers were artificially elevated beyond what was natural at the time? Now you can say, well, what's natural at the time doesn't really matter compared to what the current status is, but it does influence how we perceive the population trends. Because right now, a lot of those old farmsteads in the East and the upper Midwest are getting revegetated with woodlands. And so that might explain part of the kestrel decline. Another explanation, one that I don't particularly like, excuse me, there. An explanation that I don't particularly like, but there may be some legitimacy to it, is after DDT, Cooper's hawk numbers increased. And Cooper's hawks have adapted very well to urban areas. They've adapted well to human-dominated landscape. And Cooper's hawks will certainly hunt and kill kestrels for food. Some have speculated that because Cooper's hawk numbers have increased such that they are having a depressing effect on kestrels as well. So we don't really know what's driving that decline. There's a whole group of researchers that are kind of collaboratively working, trying to identify what might be, neonicotinoids and other pesticides might be behind it. It could be multiple things. Kestrels, a lot of people confuse a kestrel in flight with a dove. I don't know how many of you are dove hunters or have been around dove hunters, but when there's lots of doves flying, there's lots of lead flying as well. And some people aren't paying as much attention as others in some areas. So there could be the proverbial 1,000 cuts that are affecting kestrels. But on the Great Plains, the Southern Great Plains, they certainly benefited from those trees that had cavities, telegraph poles, which had woodpeckers drilling holes in them, which created cavities for kestrels. Those abandoned houses I showed you on the prairies, you go out to those and you're going to find one of two things in them. You're going to find a barn owl, or you're going to find a kestrel in them. And we even have them, like in Lubbock right now, I have them nested in some commercial buildings. I had a guy call me up from the Target store that said, hey, we got a bird out here that's attacking people. I thought, a kite at Target? And I went out there and it's a kestrel nesting behind one of their letters on their signs. And the little male kestrel was feeling his testosterone and he was stooping at people that were walking by underneath. And so it was a whole thing. Okay. So I've been studying kestrels up there for, since 2013, we started putting up nest boxes. Kestrels like to use nest boxes, so it's a good conservation tool you can use. And this is just a few of over 70 graduate students, undergraduate students, and others that have had the opportunity to come out with me when I've been banding kestrels or working with catching adults and stuff. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information from what I have for kestrels up here. So we started putting up boxes in 2013. We had a couple that were used, but we got them up kind of late. So I'm not really counting data till 2014. So not counting this year either. So this is 2014 to 2025. I've had 206 nesting attempts. So an average of 17.2 nesting attempts per year. Average of 4.6 eggs laid. These guys are productive. They're only this big. They only weigh, 120 grams, but they pop out the eggs. Really high fledging success and nesting success, 77.8% nesting success. So the birds in the boxes, they have really good nesting success. And this is a really neat thing, I think, is that on average, 20% of my nesting pairs will try to produce a second clutch. I've had at least 2 or 3 times where I had a pair where they hadn't even fledged all their young out of the nest box and the female was already laying eggs again. I have it going on this year, as a matter of fact, one. So, and the success, usually you think, well, the second nest is not going to be as successful. 171st nest was 78% success. 35 second nest had 80% success. So it's pretty much equal. And something I'm kind of proud of, I am not solely, I had a lot of people helping me, but if it wasn't for me, there's 548 baby kestrels that probably would not have fledged into the world. So I feel good about that. And I've got about another 30 going this year, so we'll see how they do. Oh yeah, there's one, a junior poking out its head out of a nest. My nest boxes are a lot better than this now. One of the things I've learned up on the Great Plains is the weather up there, it dries you out, it soaks you, and it blows you apart. And my boxes were just falling apart up there. And I've got plans now. If anybody's interested, I give you my plans for a box that I call my kinetic boxes because they stand up to a lot of kinetic energy up there. They're kind of bomb proof now. Okay. This is looking at occupancy on a per box basis. And so across that time, you can see I had one box that was occupied every year. I've had several that were occupied 11 years. And then, some that were only occupied 1 year. And it shows how many of those had the number of young they had on average per year is the blue dot. So just because they're occupied year after year after year, they may not have the highest average fledging success compared to some of those that are only occupied once or twice. But the thing is that, I mean, several of those boxes are really pretty consistently used. And we found there's really not a big difference between first and second attempts in the numbers of eggs produced. The first clutch almost, well, other than 2022, I guess, had more eggs than the second clutch. This is just kind of bookkeeping stuff. But it's kind of interesting that, you would think that the female puts all of her energy into producing that first brood, that first clutch of eggs. She's not going to be able to produce that many eggs the second time around. That doesn't seem to be the case. Okay. And then fledgling numbers. So this is something that was really cool. This is a collaborative study in which we provided blood samples from nestlings to a graduate student in Colorado. She was collecting blood samples from Florida, the eastern states, up in Wisconsin, Idaho, Washington, Saskatoon, Alaska, California, and everything. And you can see, this is several livers. Okay. Apparently, is there a laser pointer? Yeah. There is. Okay. So cool. So here we are. And notice the color. Okay. Notice the colors up here. And there's this ring around it. Okay. Basically, I'm not a geneticist, but what this tells us is that the kestrels in the southern high plains are genetically distinct from every other kestrel population in the US. Okay. So these birds, these are all the Wisconsin and northeastern state birds. These birds are all the Florida birds, which are a distinct subspecies of kestrel. Okay, so they're very well split out. The Saskatchewan, rather, Washington, Idaho, California, that's this cluster down in here. And just because they're overlapping doesn't mean they're related. It's got to do with the modeling and everything. Basically, it's that ellipse that's drawn around them that tells you if they're different from others. Okay. The light blue, these are all Alaskan birds. And the dark kind of orangish brown, those are all the Texas, the panhandle birds. And the Alaskan birds and the panhandle birds are similar in some ways, but they're distinctly different genetically. And they are different from all these other birds. And so what I think is cool about this for the Texas birds is this has probably only happened over the last 100 years. Okay, because they weren't around there. They weren't around until European settlement, and those birds started colonizing the area. This is some habitat stuff I'm gonna skip by because I think I have something else on here that I think is cooler. Oh, I don't. Okay, I'm sorry. So something I think is interesting about the kestrels that we found, and I'm gonna wrap this up, is that we put cameras up at 5 of the nests in the summer. And kestrel nestlings are there from hatch to about 28 days. So 4 weeks, okay, from hatch to fledge. And we had cameras up and we looked at the diet during that period for 4 weeks for 5 boxes. What do you think kestrels eat in the breeding season? I mean, a male kestrel weighs maybe 110 grams, 90 grams to 110 grams. A female kestrel maybe weighs up to 120 grams during the breeding season. Grasshoppers, okay. We've got one for the 6-legged critters. Anything else? Mice? Lizards? Okay. Okay, so most of the diet studies out there report insects as 70 to 80% of the diet of kestrels. Okay, and then supplemented by occasional mice. In the Caribbean, they'll get a lot of lizards. And in the winter, they will catch some birds and stuff. During that 4-week period, I had over 2,000 prey deliveries identified. 5 boxes, 4 weeks each, 2,000 prey deliveries. Was mind-boggling. And it's like, well, if they're eating insects, maybe it's not that much because they're feeding, 5 or 6 mouths in their nest. Okay. I'm really sorry I don't have pictures to show you to prove this, but I had 15 baby cottontail rabbits delivered to nests. I had several juvenile ground squirrels, antelope ground squirrels and 13-line ground squirrels delivered to nests. I had several half-grown cotton rats, and cotton rats are pretty good-sized rodent. Over 70% of what kestrels were eating, though, were lizards, the highest proportion of lizards ever reported in the scientific literature for kestrels. Unfortunately, over 500 of those were Texas horned lizards. Yeah. And so I saw that the Fort Worth Zoo was excited about releasing 200 baby horned lizards. And I'm looking at my data and I'm thinking, oh, this is not going to sell well. So yeah, but it tells me a couple of things. Either those kestrels had been there for several years at those boxes, and they were still hammering that many horned lizards, which would suggest that there's more horned lizards out there maybe than we think there are, and maybe kestrels are just a lot better at finding them than we are. So if you could train some kestrels to, do mark capture for us or something, that'd be great. But the thing is that kestrels, that's probably one of the reasons that we're seeing these large broods, these large clutch sizes, both for the first and second clutches, and the high fledging success is because they're eating really well in a typical year. They're getting a lot of high energy food coming in. Insects, there's a lot of keratin there. There's a lot of moisture, but there's not a lot of protein. And you get lizards, you get decent sized, I mean, a cottontail bunny is only this big, but it's the same size as a kestrel almost. And the videos clips I have is comical of this little female kestrel hauling this thing that weighs as much as her up to a box and trying to drag it through the hole of the box. It's kind of, it's sad, but it's kind of funny too, So I think that there's just several things going on up there that has really been beneficial for the kestrels and how they're adapting to that landscape. The take home is I wanted to provide you an understanding of how little ornithological information had been collected in that region before European settlement and why that was. I like going out and counting stuff. I'm not going to go out and count stuff if somebody's going to kill me for doing it. And that was the story before the 1900s. When the change came, it came so rapidly that we didn't even really have good information for what was on the prairie. A lot of the information is assumed or archaeological or stories from the native peoples when we talked to them. But we lost a lot more than we'll probably really know what we lost because it happened so quickly. And though also, in the terms of raptors, although some fared poorly, the ferruginous hawk certainly, burrowing owls certainly. I didn't even talk about it, the golden eagles in the region. The golden eagles nested along the Caprock Escarpment. Those numbers have been decreased dramatically due to removal of prairie dogs, due to persecution in the 1960s, 1950s, and so forth. There are still some golden eagles up there, fortunately. But there were some raptors that really did not do well because of that. But there are others that did do well. The kestrels, the kites, Swainson's hawks, they're all far more abundant than they would have been pre-settlement time. There are some species that would be really interesting to look at. Northern harriers, short-eared owls, those are two that I think would be fascinating to look at and try to glean what was there historically compared to what's there today. But those are some things that we may never know. I think just I was talking to somebody here a little bit earlier, and I think that kind of my take home on this is we hear about the bad all the time. We hear about the negative impacts that we have on the landscapes, how we lose species, and that's all absolutely true. And it can make you suicidal if you think about it just from that perspective. But I think that there is a positive thing. And I was saying earlier, I live in Lubbock, Texas. I have had dark-eyed juncos return to my backyard at least 4 years in a row. And I know that because I banded them and I've got recaptures. I had a ruby-crowned kinglet return to my yard 4 years after I banded it. They're not there through the breeding season. They migrate out and they come back. You know, I had a blue jay that was 12 years old when it was hit by a car in front of my house. Okay, and these are all birds that 150 years ago would not have been there. They're only there because of European settlement. And so, yes, we do have a negative impact on the landscape, but there is the other side. We do have what we call these recombinant ecosystems, where you change the landscape and you get different species that come in and they kind of create a new biotic community in those areas. And I'm not saying it's right to replace these other species. I'm just saying that the negatives on those other species, it's not a complete loss. We do gain some things from that. And I try to keep that positive aspect in mind when I look at some of the, prairie dog colonies where I'm at being bladed over for yet more housing. So thank you very much. I hope this was informative and, somewhat educational.
Okay, so if you'll answer a few questions, I'm gonna walk around with my little tiny microphone so that the people online. Do you have a question, sir?
Yes, I do. You were talking about nest fidelity earlier with the kestrels in the boxes that you set up.
Mhm.
Did you find when you banded and you were able to identify the banding, et cetera, that you had box fidelity as well, that the kestrels would return?
Okay, so when I was talking about fidelity,
Mhm.
that was the Mississippi kites
Yes.
that I had the bands on, so I know that. We did some banding on the kestrels, and we did have site fidelity, but we didn't have enough of a study where I'm confident saying much about that or anything about the survival of them. I suspect there's high fidelity based on what I saw, but I don't have enough data to really.
Thank you for all the information. This is a very broad question. Could you comment on the actual placement of those kestrel boxes in terms of where you put them with regard to height, buildings,
Sure.
whatever?
I went out and said, that looks good. No, so in reality, outside of Lubbock, there's the former Reese Air Force Base that was decommissioned many years ago. And before I got there, there'd been an ecotoxicology person that had put up some nest boxes out on that. And he was doing that to look at contaminants and eggs and everything. Well, he left, those boxes had fallen apart. And so I thought, I had a project that started up out there. So I thought, well, this would be a good spot to incorporate a kestrel study. So I went out there and there was a lot of poles out there in different areas, and I pretty much had access to anything I wanted to put them up on. So I pretty much equidistantly spaced boxes apart, about a half mile apart, and I put them up how high I could get a ladder, basically. So I try to keep most of them about 10 feet off the ground, 10 to 12 feet, and in an eastward or southeastward facing direction. I have put up a couple that were north facing, and those have not been used. So that was it. And then the Lubbock Lake landmark, they had some sites for it. And so I put 3 nest boxes up out there. And then we had some on the Texas Tech property, which actually Texas Tech has this, what they call the rangeland property. And I put boxes up out there on some poles that were fairly short. And I've had kestrels nesting in boxes that I could reach up and unlatch. They were that low at the rangeland. Now at the rangeland, they're not really bothered by anybody. It's kind of a protected area. The only reason I put the nest boxes out low is because that's how high the poles were. Okay, so that's pretty much it.
Do you have predator guards on any of your boxes?
Nope.
No. Anyone else have a question? Okay, hold on, Patsy. To your knowledge, was there any attempt to collaborate with the now displaced indigenous Comanche to learn the history of birds?
With the what?
With the Comanches, like, was there any history that
they passed along about birds.
To collaborate with the Comanches to get information? Not that I know of. No. And there's an aspect of, you know, there's this thing called traditional indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge of native peoples. And that can be really valuable, but you also have to approach it, in my opinion, you have to approach it with a little bit of caution because, you know, an indigenous person, somebody that is, you know, truly adheres to the indigenous beliefs and everything, they may be able to tell me a lot about an owl's presence on the reservation, but they may also tell me that when they hear an owl, that's bad and somebody's going to die or something. You know, both those things are traditional knowledge. And so we have to have kind of a filter and quality control on that knowledge that we take. I'm not saying that I don't mean to be demeaning or anything, but I mean, there is a range of what people will think and believe. And there's a difference between actually knowing something and just having a traditional belief, and teasing those things out is an important thing. Okay. I know it's Matt, right? Mark, I'm sorry, Mark. I'm sorry. Okay. Marky, Matt, Mark here. Okay. I'm sorry, Mark. We were talking about Puerto Rico earlier. In Puerto Rico, one of the indigenous beliefs is that the Puerto Rican screech owl eats coffee beans. And so they will kill screech owls around coffee plantations because of that belief. Not everybody, but that is one of those indigenous beliefs that have been carried forward. Now, from a certain perspective, that could be traditional ecological knowledge when it's not true. So that's why approaching the indigenous tribes for knowledge, it's a great way to find out things, but you have to have your filter on. Okay.
Also, when you talk to just regular people, a lot of them have the same kind of thing.
My grandparents told me about the rattlesnake fang in the boot that would kill you if you put the boot on. You know.
Yeah.
Do you know where that came from?
No.
Okay. Look up there's a book called Under a Raging Sky. It's a biography of Audubon. Audubon was telling that story when he was in France. And that story was told to me by my grandparents when I was a kid. And that's how those stories can live for hundreds of years.
A lot of people love the truth. They spend all their time embellishing it. But my question has, with this data that you have now on these species that you discussed, we have climate change going on. All kinds of things are happening, continuing to change with the water situation up in the panhandle and all that. And you're grooming a lot of graduate students, I hope, to go ahead and continue these studies to see what the changes are, model what the changes could be under the future. Can you say anything about what's going on there?
I had a student, we were working on prairie chickens, and one of the things we looked at was nest microclimate. I've gotten really interested in nest microclimate as far as temperature and humidity and how that is influenced by the presence of the adult bird and how that may be influenced by environmental conditions. And we published a couple of papers on this, but one of the things we looked at was there's also thermal tolerances on not only what eggs can handle, but what nestlings could handle. And we lose a lot of nestling prairie chickens. And we don't really know what happens to them. And a lot of times you'd like to say, well, it's predators, you know, roadrunners get them or snakes get them. Or, you know, if you have a whole brood of prairie chickens or a brood of quail or any of these gallinaceous birds that are out there, one predator is not going to get them all, you know. But what can get them all is heat, you know, or cold when they get wet and can't thermoregulate. And so I think that, you know, looking at those things is very important. And we prognosticated with, I didn't do this, my student did it because he was the modeler, much smarter than I am. And, you know, looking at 70-year projections for like prairie chickens in the Southern Plains, it's not good. You know, as far as them just being able to survive and, you know, be successful in nesting. And we haven't really done this with raptor nests. There's been some efforts recently um, by a consortium of us I participated in, but we were looking at Swainson's hawks, peregrines, golden eagle, some species of concern, and looking at heat exposure and what that may have. So there is work and concern going on in that direction. I think the southwestern US in particular is really ripe for this kind of work because it's going to be experiencing the most dramatic heat changes and aridification changes. Another thing with the climate change, though, that we often forget about is we talk about the increasing heat. In the western region, that increasing heat usually goes along with decreasing humidity. And decreasing humidity can kill an egg just as much as the heat can. But that may be different in the southeast where you have heat and humidity, you know, and that gets into how like an altricial nest, like a raptor nest, and how they can thermoregulate. If it's hot but it's dry, respiratory evapotranspiration can work, but it can desiccate the nestling to where, I mean, they can't drink water, and so there's that trade-off at some point. If it's really humid and hot, it doesn't work, and they're going to overheat. And so there's those thermal tolerances that we need to look at. And just looking at one species in one area doesn't mean how it's going to be affected elsewhere. So it's a very, very complex one to look at.
Okay, we're going to take one more question.
Clint, in your middle image of the three landscape changes of energy production, wind and oil and gas, and then the center one, and I've flown the Panhandle a number of times, especially in Google Earth, and that some places around Lubbock are the most intensely agricultural landscapes on the planet, with the center pivot irrigation, and square plots of pasture land. I've also flown the border of Texas and New Mexico on the Panhandle, and New Mexico in the west has a lot more rangeland with BLM and New Mexico Fish and Game Land. And I wonder if you've seen any kind of east-west gradient or transition between the two geographies in raptor density or abundance or usage.
We did some survey work a few years back, in particular for eagles, but we were looking for other raptors as well. And you get over into the western border country of New Mexico, you pick up a lot more golden eagles, you pick up more ferruginous hawks. Didn't get as many Swainson's hawks as I recall. I don't think we got even close to as many Swainson's hawks in a lot of that area. But most of the studies I've been doing right now haven't really looked across the border, so I wouldn't want to speak to that. But one thing I would like to just add on, if I may, just for a second, is yeah, that area up there, it's one of the most intensively agricultural lands, and we're losing the water. There are areas where they don't have water anymore up there. And there has been some talk about when these lands are no longer able to be useful for crops, is trying to revert them to shortgrass prairie, which would be good if we can do it. Creating shortgrass prairie is not easy. Getting buffalo grass established, getting blue grama established on these rangelands, it's not easy, but it can be done. They've done it on CRP. And so there may be a shifting transition in some areas. There's some areas around the Muleshoe Wildlife Refuge that they're looking at. If these landowners want to sell because it can no longer be productive crop-wise, those are areas that the refuge system may be interested in acquiring and trying to expand and restore that into shortgrass prairie. And that would be really beneficial in that area for species like lesser prairie chicken. This discussion that I'm talking about now, when I heard it, that was before the current presidential administration. And this administration is, I mean, everybody knows there's kind of, we don't know where anything's going right now. The refuge system is not doing great, so that may be off the table right now, but maybe it won't be. So I think that's kind of maybe a positive as far as reverting some of that agricultural land back to a prairie grassland. So, okay, I think That's it then? Thank you.
You guys, finish the food, please.